What we are witnessing right now is something few people ever thought they would see. Donald Trump watching as federal authorities begin the formal process of taking control of his properties. This isn't symbolic. This isn't theoretical. This is the real-world enforcement of a massive fraud judgment unfolding in real time. The judge overseeing the case didn't simply reject Trump's emergency legal challenges. She systematically dismantled them, issuing a ruling so blunt and unforgiving that legal analysts are calling it one of the most severe opinions ever written against a former president. Every argument Trump's lawyers raised was taken apart piece by piece, leaving no room for ambiguity about how the court viewed his conduct or his credibility. This financial reckoning was triggered by Trump's own legal team, who rushed to file last-minute motions claiming that the asset seizures were unconstitutional, politically motivated, and would cause irreparable harm to Trump's business empire. They argued that enforcing the judgment while appeals were pending would devastate his companies and unfairly punish him before higher courts could intervene. The judge's response was devastating. She labeled the arguments frivolous, legally baseless, and insulting to the integrity of the court. She made it clear that this wasn't a close call or a novel legal question. In her view, Trump's team wasn't making good faith arguments. They were attempting to delay accountability using claims the court had already rejected. What's happening now goes far beyond a wealthy businessman losing a few assets. This is the systematic unraveling of the Trump organization itself. Properties that have defined Trump's brand for decades, iconic buildings that shaped the Manhattan skyline and his public image, are now being cataloged, valued, and prepared for seizure to satisfy an enormous civil fraud judgment. Once court-appointed officials begin inventorying assets, assessing values, and establishing control, legal accountability stops being abstract. It becomes unmistakably real. When padlocks are placed on doors and court orders govern who controls the property, the mythology collapses. It's staggering to consider that an empire built over more than 50 years long, presented as proof of unparalleled business genius, now risks falling apart because it was propped up by persistent exaggerations about what it was actually worth. To understand how this escalated so quickly, you have to look at the case itself. This all traces back to New York Attorney General Letitia James and her sweeping civil fraud lawsuit against Donald Trump, his adult sons, and the Trump Organization. After years of investigation, James alleged that Trump routinely inflated property values when seeking loans and insurance, while simultaneously deflating those same values when tax bills came due. These weren't minor discrepancies or clerical errors. Investigators found that Trump claimed his penthouse apartment was nearly 3 times its actual size. He valued Mar-a-Lago at more than $500 million, despite restrictions that made such valuations implausible. Across his portfolio, appraisals were manipulated in a consistent and deliberate pattern. The case went to trial in late 2023. Judge Arthur Engoron ultimately concluded that Trump had engaged in persistent, long-running fraud over decades. In February 2024, the court entered a judgment exceeding $450 million with interest and ordered the disgorgement of profits obtained through fraudulent practices. Trump appealed immediately. But here's where legal theory collided with reality. Under New York law, filing an appeal does not stop enforcement of a judgment unless the defendant posts a bond covering the full amount plus interest. In practical terms, that meant Trump needed close to $500 million in cash or extremely reliable collateral to freeze the collection process. Reporting revealed that Trump's team approached more than 30 bond and insurance companies and failed. The reason was simple and devastating. Trump's fraud conviction had destroyed the credibility of his property valuations. No reputable financial institution was willing to accept his assets at the values he claimed. Asset seizures are extraordinarily rare for former presidents. They don't happen to people who truly have the liquidity they boast about. They happen when courts issue massive judgments, legal options are exhausted, and the debtor either cannot or will not pay. Reaching this stage says far more about Trump's real financial position than decades of branding ever did. This is where things took a dramatic turn. Multiple outlets reported that the seizure process moved forward as state attorneys, federal marshals, and court-appointed receivers arrived at Trump properties with court orders. At 40 Wall Street, officials entered the building to inventory assets and establish control procedures. At Seven Springs, Trump's sprawling Westchester estate, appraisers were granted access to conduct formal valuations. Even Trump Tower, synonymous with Trump's brand for nearly 40 years, was assessed as authorities evaluated how it could be transferred or liquidated. Trump's lawyers responded with emergency filings, arguing that taking control of the properties would cause chaos, harm tenants and employees, and amount to an unconstitutional seizure. They claimed the case was politically driven, insisting the Attorney General was pursuing a vendetta and that enforcing the judgment before appeals concluded violated due process. The court was unmoved. In a sharply worded decision, the judge rejected every claim. Legal analysts noted how unusually direct the language was. The court emphasized that Trump had received a full trial, presented evidence, cross-examined witnesses, and was afforded every procedural protection. The judgment, the court made clear, was not a surprise. It was the foreseeable result of conduct already found to be fraudulent. On the claim of irreparable harm, the judge was blunt. Any harm Trump faced was self-inflicted. If he wanted to stop enforcement, he could have posted the legally required bond. His failure to do so was not the court's problem. The ruling then turned sharper. Addressing claims of political persecution, the judge rejected the idea outright, calling it unsupported and offensive to the integrity of the judicial system. The court stressed that Trump's habit of reframing legal defeats as conspiracies was bad faith and corrosive to public trust. This ruling leaves Trump's legal team in an impossible position. His appeal continues, but enforcement proceeds simultaneously. Each day without a bond allows further asset evaluation, liens, and preparations for sale. And finding a bond now would require either convincing institutions that already rejected his valuations or producing nearly $500 million in cash. Every legal avenue has been attempted. Emergency stays denied. Constitutional arguments rejected. Appeals courts unmoved. What remains is a simple reality. A court found Trump liable, imposed a massive judgment, and the law requires payment. Legal experts say this moment represents a collision between Trump's carefully cultivated image and legal reality. For decades, he presented himself as a billionaire mastermind. Now, a court has found much of that image was built on inflated numbers, and the market has confirmed it by refusing to back him. This has enormous consequences. Financially, Trump risks losing some of his most iconic holdings. Politically, images of court-supervised seizures strike at the core of his brand as a successful businessman. Institutionally, the case reinforces a foundational principle. Power and prominence do not place anyone above the law. Here's the bottom line. Donald Trump is facing the real-world enforcement of a massive fraud judgment. The judge didn't merely reject his arguments, she dismantled them, calling them frivolous and insulting. His inability to secure a bond shows that neither the courts nor the market believe his valuations. This isn't persecution. It's accountability. And as the asset seizure process continues, the consequences for Trump's empire, his political future, and the rule of law are only just beginning.